We're told a simple story about the 19th century. It was the age of steam and soot, of mankind fumbling its way toward industrial civilization. Blacksmiths and forge workers supposedly created architectural marvels that we struggle to replicate today, even with our laser cutters and computer-aided design. But the official narrative conveniently ignores one glaring impossibility that tears the whole story apart: the metal. Where did all that metal come from in an era when most people still traveled by horse and wagon? The most celebrated examples of this impossibility stand before us even now: the Crystal Palace in London and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. We're calmly informed that these colossal structures were sketched out on paper by candlelight, then forged and erected by barely educated laborers in absurdly short time frames. But the moment you start doing the actual math, consulting real metallurgy manuals, the official story doesn't just crack, it collapses entirely, exposing a void where answers should be. Our journey into this void begins with what the Victorians called the eighth wonder of the world: London, 1851. The Great Exhibition opens inside a structure unlike anything the public has supposedly ever seen: the Crystal Palace, a shimmering cathedral of iron and glass stretching across Hyde Park. Over 90,000 square meters of exhibition space, a length of 564 meters, and all of it, we're assured, designed by a gardener, Joseph Paxton, a man whose previous experience consisted of building greenhouses. Suddenly, he conceives a design requiring engineering calculations, comparable to modern materials science. The leap in complexity is staggering, but the truly impossible part isn't the design, it's the materials themselves. The construction demanded 4,000 tons of cast iron and structural steel, alongside 300,000 panes of hand-blown glass, 4,000 tons of metal. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. In the mid-1800s, metallurgy was supposedly in its infancy. To produce such quantities of pure, high-grade cast iron suitable for load-bearing architecture, you'd need to process tens of thousands of tons of raw ore. You'd need to burn mountains of coal. Where were these vast mining operations? Where were the foundries capable of outputting materials of such consistent quality at such speed? If we examine Britain's documented iron production figures for that period, the entire national industry would have needed to focus exclusively on this single project, abandoning all production of railway tracks, machinery, weapons, everything. The numbers don't add up. They never have. And the situation becomes even more absurd when we cross the Channel to France. Paris, 1889. The Exposition Universelle unveils its centerpiece, the tallest structure on Earth, the Eiffel Tower, completed in 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days. The metal structure weighs 700 tons, 7,000 tons of specialty puddled iron. Now, puddling is a process where molten pig iron is manually stirred inside a furnace using long iron rods. The goal is to burn off excess carbon, purifying the metal. It's brutal, exhausting, dangerously inefficient work. With this method, achieving material uniformity is virtually impossible. Every batch would vary in composition and tensile strength. Yet the tower stands, flawlessly assembled from 18,000 individual metal components. To produce 7,000 tons of puddled iron would have required entire battalions of workers stirring molten metal around the clock for years. And again, the economic questions become impossible to ignore. France in the late 1800s was struggling financially, recovering from wars and economic crises. Yet suddenly, the state allocates enormous funds and vast quantities of strategic material, high-quality iron, to construct what was essentially a decorative exhibition arch, an arch with no military value, no industrial function. Where is the economic logic? This resembles less a demonstration of national power and more like the utilization of a pre-existing resource that came at virtually no cost. We're confronted with a fundamental impossibility. The official dates and production figures cannot coexist with the laws of physics and economics. Producing such volumes of metal with the stated technology was impossible. But even if we grant them this miracle, what comes next pushes the story into pure fantasy. All that metal had to get there. Even if we were generous enough to concede that this metal was somehow miraculously produced, it then faced an even more insurmountable challenge: transportation. In the mid-19th century, railway networks were sparse and limited in capacity. The dominant method of moving heavy freight remained what it had been for centuries: horse-drawn carts. Now try to picture this scene: thousands upon thousands of wagons hauled by exhausted horses, carrying multi-ton cast-iron beams and elaborate trusses through muddy, rutted roads across England and France. Each wagon crawls forward, creating traffic bottlenecks that stretch for miles. Delivering 400 tons of construction materials to Hyde Park should have triggered a transportation catastrophe that paralyzed London for months, potentially a full year. The same applies to Paris during the Eiffel Tower's construction. The city center should have transformed into an impenetrable maze of building materials, carts, and animals. This would have dominated newspaper headlines for months. It would have been the primary topic of public conversation. City authorities would have left extensive records documenting their desperate attempts to manage this logistical nightmare. But when you search the archives from that period, you find silence. Deafening silence. No reports of traffic apocalypse, no complaints from merchants unable to move goods, no municipal records of emergency measures. Both gigantic structures rose in the hearts of Europe's busiest cities, as though their components simply materialized on site, like mushrooms appearing overnight after rain. But the logistical impossibility is merely the appetizer. The true technological miracle, the part that borders on science fiction, begins at the moment of assembly. The Eiffel Tower consists of 1838 separate metal pieces, held together by 2.5 million rivets. Each rivet required heating until red hot, inserting through a precisely drilled hole, then hammering from both sides by a coordinated team before it cooled and contracted, creating a tight bond. All of this performed at tremendous heights in unpredictable winds, where the slightest error could mean death. The official account tells us that every hole for these millions of rivets was pre-drilled at various factories scattered across the country. Eiffel's engineers, armed with nothing but slide rules and paper drawings, supposedly calculated all 18,000 unique components with precision down to fractions of a millimeter. They never once made an error. Think about what that means. This is statistically impossible. In that era, unified measurement standards were barely emerging. Each factory, each workshop operated with its own templates, its own interpretation of inches and feet. To believe that thousands of laborers in different regions, using different tools and working under different conditions, manufactured millions of components that assembled together perfectly during construction is to believe in magic. Even today, with computer-aided design, laser measurement systems, and CNC precision machining, major construction projects regularly encounter problems with parts that don't quite fit. Components require on-site adjustment, modification, rework. But under the conditions we're told existed, the Eiffel Tower's assembly should have devolved into an endless nightmare of filing, forcing, and constant improvisation. Instead, it's perfect. Its lines are flawless. Its geometry is pristine. This points to one inescapable conclusion. All components were manufactured at a single, extraordinarily advanced production facilities operating under incredibly strict tolerances and standards. A facility that does not exist anywhere in the official historical record of the 19th century. The same story repeats with the Crystal Palace. Elegant artistic castings, thousands of standardized components fitting together seamlessly. Such precision and quality seem to defy the capabilities of the era. But what makes this story even stranger is what eventually happened to one of these supposedly eternal structures. November 30th, 1936, the Crystal Palace burned. A building constructed primarily of iron and glass burned to the ground like kindling. Cast iron doesn't burn. Glass requires temperatures comparable to industrial furnaces to melt. To utterly destroy such a massive structure would require far more than an accidental fire. So, what really happened? The night of November 30th, 1936, witnessed the death of an icon. A massive glow illuminated the London sky, visible for dozens of miles in every direction. The Crystal Palace was burning, the pride of Victorian Britain, a structure that had captivated engineers and architects for nearly a century, was being consumed. According to the official story, it began with a small office fire that, aided by strong winds, rapidly spread throughout the massive building. The blaze raged with such inexplicable ferocity that thousands of tons of cast iron didn't just heat up or warp. It melted, flowing in molten rivers while the glass roof shattered explosively, raining down in a storm of liquefied material. By dawn, all that remained of this symbol of technological achievement was a twisted, smoking skeleton. But there's a fundamental problem with this tragic narrative that troubles anyone willing to examine it closely. The problem exists in the realm of basic physics. Cast iron, the primary structural material of the palace, is not combustible. Its melting point hovers around 1,200 degrees Celsius. To bring 4,500 tons of metal distributed across a vast area to such temperatures requires not merely a fire, but essentially a giant blast furnace. An ordinary fire fueled by burning wooden floors and exhibition displays cannot generate or sustain such monstrous heat throughout the entire volume of a building. It might damage sections, cause partial collapse, but it cannot completely incinerate an entire metal structure. The same principle applies to glass. For 90,000 square meters of glass, not merely to crack from heat stress, but to actually melt into liquid form, requires temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. Witnesses described not just flames, but something resembling an inferno, inexplicable given the chemistry of ordinary combustion. A structure built from essentially non-combustible materials vanished as though it were constructed from dry timber. This suggests the official cause is nothing more than a convenient cover story. For the first time in this investigation, we must consider reclassifying this event from accident to conspiracy. This wasn't a fire. This was a deliberately planned and flawlessly executed operation of total destruction. Complete annihilation, leaving no possibility for restoration or, more critically, for investigation. When the flames finally died, there was nothing left to investigate. Only heaps of melted metal and pulverized glass, where conducting materials analysis to study composition or manufacturing techniques became impossible. The crucial question emerges: what evidence needed to be so urgently and thoroughly erased from existence? What secrets were embedded in this delicate palace that demanded such drastic action? Perhaps the answer lies in the material itself. What if chemical analysis of those 1851 cast iron beams, conducted with 20th or 21st century technology, would have revealed a composition or casting methodology absolutely impossible for that supposed era? What if alloying elements or metallurgical structures were discovered indicating a far more advanced science? Fire is the perfect instrument for concealing such secrets. It erases all evidence, reducing proof to shapeless slag. The Crystal Palace wasn't just architecture, it was an artifact, physical evidence of technologies that don't fit the official timeline we've been taught. Its elimination became necessary to preserve the integrity of the historical narrative. But if the Crystal Palace required destruction to hide something, perhaps other similar achievements weren't what they appeared to be either. This pattern of grandiose construction followed by mysterious disappearance repeated itself again and again. And the perfect stage for this recurring drama was the phenomenon known as the World's Fairs. The mysterious destruction of the Crystal Palace wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely the opening act in a spectacular performance that played out globally during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The venues for this drama were the World's Fairs: Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia. The script remained strikingly consistent. Within impossibly short time frames, usually 1 or 2 years, entire dream cities would rise from empty ground. Majestic palaces, elaborate pavilions, monumental architecture in classical or neoclassical styles. These complexes were staggering in scale, architectural sophistication, and technological innovation. Widespread electric illumination, moving walkways, advanced water features. The most striking example remains the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the White City. Across hundreds of hectares, an architectural ensemble emerged that rivaled ancient Rome in grandeur: gleaming white colonnades, massive domes, artificial canals with gondolas, thousands of electric lights transforming night into day. The official history assures us this magnificence was merely temporary staging, constructed from cheap materials: wooden frames covered with a mixture of plaster and hemp fiber, temporary pavilions to showcase industrial achievements. But this explanation strains credulity. Here's where the pattern becomes unmistakable. After operating for just a few months, these fairs would close. Almost immediately afterward, these grand complexes met identical fates. They were either demolished with inexplicable urgency or mysteriously destroyed by devastating fires. A remarkably convenient method for disposing of temporary buildings, don't you think? Fire erases everything. However, when the smoke cleared and demolition crews began their work, the illusion of temporary construction shattered completely. Beneath charred plaster facades, a picture emerged that utterly contradicted the official narrative. Powerful steel frameworks became visible, identical to those used in constructing the first skyscrapers. Solid brick walls appeared, testifying to permanence and structural strength. Workers discovered deep foundations extending far underground, capable of supporting not cardboard models, but genuine stone buildings multiple stories high. Why construct permanent architecture designed to endure for centuries, only to use it for a single season before destroying it? It represents economic insanity with no rational explanation. This consistent pattern of rapid creation, followed by even more rapid destruction, leads to a disturbing hypothesis. What if the organizers of these expositions weren't builders at all? What if they were actually liquidators? Imagine this scenario. Authorities discover a city or industrial complex that survived some global catastrophe, perhaps partially buried underground. These ancient structures are cordoned off. A swift restoration begins. The buildings are cleaned, given fresh appearances, utilities are connected. Then a sign appears announcing a World's Fair celebrating industrial achievement. And the public from across the globe is invited to admire these supposedly new wonders. It was an elaborate cover-up operation on a massive scale. They weren't displaying their own achievements. They were exhibiting the legacy of a far more advanced previous civilization, fraudulently presenting it as their own work. After the exposition served its purpose, the evidence, the buildings themselves, was systematically destroyed. Demolished or burned so that independent analysis of materials and construction techniques became impossible. Buildings weren't the only casualties. It was technology itself being destroyed. Technologies that could have offered humanity a completely different developmental path. To understand the true motive behind this global crime, we need to stop viewing these structures through a tourist's eyes. We need to see them as an energy engineer would. The destruction of these magnificent structures wasn't mere vandalism or economic necessity. It was targeted erasure of evidence, a systematic wiping from Earth, not just of buildings, but of the fundamental principles underlying their construction. To understand the motive for this planetary-scale crime, we must abandon viewing the Eiffel Tower, the Crystal Palace, and World's Fair pavilions as tourists or architects do. We need the perspective of an energy engineer. When you shift your viewpoint, behind the delicate ironwork and elegant forms, their true technical purpose becomes unmistakable. These aren't decorative arches or exhibition halls. These are enormous components of an extraordinarily sophisticated technical system, parts of a single planetary machine. All this architecture of iron, copper, and stone formed part of a global network for harvesting, converting, and transmitting atmospheric electricity. Or, as it was known in earlier times, the ether. This represented technology operating on entirely different physical principles than our primitive system of resource combustion. Ancient civilizations apparently understood how to harness energy that literally surrounds us everywhere. Examine the structure of the Eiffel Tower. It's not merely a tower, it's a perfect antenna. Its spire functions as a classic ionizer and discharge point, designed to interact with upper atmospheric layers. Its entire metal framework acts as a massive waveguide, a resonator precisely tuned to specific frequencies. And its true foundations, extending deep underground and hidden from public view, served as powerful grounding systems, creating potential differences between Earth and atmosphere. The metal employed in these structures possessed special properties: high conductivity, capacity for resonance, properties we're only beginning to rediscover now. This wasn't a standalone installation. The domes and spires of ancient cathedrals, railway stations, government buildings worldwide, these were all elements of a unified energy grid. They harvested energy from the atmosphere and likely transmitted it wirelessly for illumination, heating, powering mechanisms we can't begin to understand. Free energy, clean energy, inexhaustible energy accessible to everyone, anywhere on the planet. Those who seized power following the 19th century global catastrophe understood perfectly what they'd discovered. They found a functioning, or easily repairable energy infrastructure capable of transforming human existence into something approaching paradise. But they didn't want paradise, they wanted power, and power is constructed on resource control. Free energy makes people free and independent, but energy that must be extracted, transported, and sold, coal, oil, natural gas, makes people slaves bound to a system. This is precisely why, during the late 19th century, we observe a bizarre and illogical contradiction. Alongside these standing, and possibly still operational etheric power stations, we see aggressive promotion of primitive, dirty, inefficient technologies, internal combustion engines, steam engines burning fossil fuels. This was the greatest act of sabotage in human history. To force us to pay for light and warmth, the old infrastructure of free energy first had to be destroyed. This is the true reason the Crystal Palace burned. This is why magnificent American pavilions were demolished and incinerated. It wasn't removal of temporary buildings. It was warfare against technologies of freedom. They deliberately forced us into a technological dead end based on consumption and planetary destruction, hiding from us the key to harmonious existence. Nikola Tesla wasn't an inventor in the conventional sense. He was more accurately a brilliant restorer. He discovered access to surviving fragments of knowledge from that era and attempted to revive them, to return humanity's inheritance. His Wardenclyffe Tower was an attempt to recreate one element of that ancient energy grid. He was immediately stopped and destroyed by financial elites. Banker J.P. Morgan, whose fortune and power were built on selling copper wiring and investing in coal and oil industries. Free energy represented a death sentence to them. They didn't just steal our energy, they stole our past. To construct their new reality, they needed new people. But where would they find them in a world devastated by catastrophe? The new reality based on scarcity and control required not only destruction of old technologies, but creation of a new society, a society devoid of memory regarding its past. Here we arrive at the most chilling aspect of this investigation. This part concerns not metal and energy, but humanity itself. If you carefully examine photographs from the second half of the 19th century, you'll notice a strange, unsettling anomaly. The cities in these images, St. Petersburg, Paris, Washington, London, appear virtually deserted. We see magnificent architecture, broad avenues, complex infrastructure, but the streets are practically empty of people. Official science explains this as technical limitations of early photography. Supposedly, due to long exposure, times lasting several minutes, moving objects, people, carriages, simply failed to register on photographic plates, leaving only emptiness. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny. Even with extended exposure, moving objects should leave blurred shadows, smeared silhouettes, motion trails on cobblestones. Instead, what we observe are crystal clear, lifeless streets, perfect cobblestones showing not the slightest trace of activity. It creates the distinct impression that photographers were capturing not thriving metropolises, but giant ghost towns. Against this backdrop of visual emptiness, official demographic statistics from that period appear even more bizarre. They speak of explosive population growth, millions supposedly flooding into factories and filling cities. But mathematics is stubborn. To construct and maintain all the infrastructure we observe required millions of skilled workers, engineers, craftsmen. Where did they come from in a world that, by all appearances, had just experienced catastrophe leaving behind empty cities? This demographic paradox becomes even more sinister when we recall two social phenomena from that era that historians carefully avoid discussing. The first is the orphan trains in the United States. From the mid-19th through early 20th century, special trains ran from major East Coast cities into the nation's interior, transporting hundreds of thousands of children. These children, whose origins were unknown, were simply distributed to farmers and settlers as labor. Where did these millions of parentless children originate? Where did their parents vanish in such numbers that it required a nationwide distribution program? The second phenomenon is the strange prevalence of child labor throughout Europe. Child chimney sweeps, child miners. These weren't isolated instances of hardship, but mass phenomena indicating catastrophic shortage of adult workforce. A picture emerges of a world after global cataclysm that eliminated most of the adult population, leaving behind millions of orphans and empty cities built by a previous civilization. Here, at the intersection of these facts, the most incredible hypothesis emerges. The new masters of the world, who seized power after the Great Reset, faced a shortage of human resources for their new economic model. So, they initiated a program of artificial repopulation. And evidence for this was displayed openly at those very same World's Fairs. Adjacent to pavilions showcasing technological wonders stood equally popular pavilions, featuring infant incubators. We're told these were charitable endeavors to save premature babies, but the scale is staggering. These were genuine human hatcheries, pavilions filled with rows of incubators containing thousands of infants without parents. These children were displayed to the public as another attraction, another triumph of progress. Later, once grown, they ended up in orphanages, then onto orphan trains, or into factories. All the links form a single monstrous chain. The empty cities left by the previous civilization were repopulated with new humans, artificially cultivated, deprived of parents, history, memory. We were raised anew, given primitive technologies and false history. Today we live among the legacy of giants without understanding what it is. We are a planetary-scale cargo cult, like tribes that constructed straw airplanes hoping to bring back gifts from the sky. We walk across bridges whose operational principles are forgotten. We inhabit houses we cannot build with equivalent durability and elegance. We discovered cities, machines, and tools left for us, then reduced their purposes to the simplest functions we could comprehend, or transformed them into objects of worship. Cultural monuments. We're living on a grand stage set we didn't construct. Our entire history of the past 2 centuries is an elaborate script written to explain where this stage set originated. We were told fairy tales about heroic industrial revolution, about solitary geniuses who invented steam engines and erected iron palaces by candlelight. But in reality, it wasn't a story of invention. It was a story of rediscovery and appropriation. A story of how our ancestors, survivors, or newly created, excavated, cleaned, and restarted the infrastructure of a previous civilization, but in primitive, stripped-down form. Now return to the Eiffel Tower, where our investigation began. Look at it again with new understanding. It's not the symbol of Paris, not a triumph of 19th century engineering. It's a tombstone, a monument marking the grave of a great civilization whose technology we couldn't comprehend, much less replicate. It's a memorial to the greatest act of sabotage in history, when humanity was diverted from a path of harmony and free energy onto a path of slavish resource consumption. It's a deactivated generator of free atmospheric energy that, in our ignorance, we use as an observation deck and backdrop for tourist photographs. We worship these iron skeletons without suspecting they're dormant machines. Every old railway station with intricate metal vaults, every riveted bridge spanning a river, every cast iron fence in an ancient park. This isn't merely architecture. These are fragments of former greatness, silent witnesses to the great lie upon which our society is constructed. They stand among our concrete boxes as reproach, reminders that we're living atop ruins while proudly calling it progress. We admire the form, having completely forgotten the function. We call art what was once advanced technology, the great fires of Moscow and Washington, the devastating fires in American cities, World's Fair pavilions burning one after another. These weren't accidents, but stages in a war of erasure. The old world, with its harmony of metal and stone, with its etheric energy, was purposefully destroyed. Upon its rubble, our world was built, a world of soot, oil, debt, and lies, where we're forced to pay for what was once as free as the air we breathe. Next time you pass an old bridge or grand railway station, ask yourself this question: is this a monument to our progress or a fragment of greatness we've lost? And the most important question of all, if we ever remember how it all actually works, will they allow us to flip the switch again?